We are a racial justice law center with more than 35 years of using our knowledge of the law and our advocacy and organizing capacity to really work on behalf of New Yorkers of African descent and the disenfranchised. And this course, the redistricting course, which is going to be taught by our research team director, Dr. Zalima Blair. She's going to be teaching this course and did a masterful job in our last session. And the reason that we are committed to this course and to the subsequent education opportunities that we'll be providing hereafter really is because of our commitment to using education as a capacity expanding tool for communities of African descent in the city of New York. Those of you who know our history know that we have many, many decades of litigation and attorneys coming in and using our legal prowess in order to engage with racial issues of racial injustice. But the reality is that we are unfortunately living in a time when it's not enough to just have an active legal community. We must also have an active, empowered community that is going to be able to really get the tools that are necessary for self-advocacy so that our community is best able to really bring all of our fruits to bear. And so this course is definitely a part of that. And we'll invite you to follow along at our website, clsj.org, where you can sign up for our email subscription list in order to stay connected and get access to additional information. So I'm not going to be before you long, but I really just wanted to come in and help set the tone. This is not for altruistic benefit, right? We are not simply here because we love Black people, although that is definitely part of why we are here, is a love for our community. But we're also here because redistricting is about political power. And redistricting is the process of redrawing political district boundaries for the purposes of ensuring that communities of interest, which Dr. Blair powerfully walked us through last week, so that communities of interest have a shot at choosing someone to represent them who is going to be able to connect with their community. We know from last week that district boundaries often determine who gets elected and the capacity and the strength of the communities therein to really find that person who's going to be able to speak to their interests. These trainings are designed to increase effective participation and advocacy in the redistricting process. There are going to be hearings that the Independent Redistricting Commission is going to be holding. They are going to need to hear from you. They're going to need to know, what does your community look like? Where does your community start and where does it end? Does it make sense to have this school in your community boundary lines when perhaps no one from your community actually attends? Are these questions that are going to be able to really help you advocate? Yes, they are. And they're also questions that are going to be able to help you figure out who is in your community right now that is doing this work, who is of like mind that you can organize and activate and work with to ensure that you are able to secure equitable political power. These workshops are also designed to increase participation in this process, as I mentioned, and because at the end of this process, we are going to be creating maps. You guys are going to get 2 full weeks of session time where we're going to be looking at creating maps that really reflect the communities of interest that can assist us at the Center for Law and Social Justice with our longer term map drawing exercise and our official map submissions. We need to know where you think your communities start and where you think they end. We need to know why you think that so that we can effectively channel those voices when we are engaged in the advocacy that will come later on in the process. So just a bit of a level set here. It is truly my pleasure to turn this back over to the experts in the room. It is very nice to have a team where you don't have to be the only person. And when you're surrounded by genius, that is very, very helpful. So I'm going to turn this back to the experts here, the researchers, those folks who know how to take this data, explain this data for those of us who are learning it for the first time, or even for those of us who are seeing it again, but just need some good reminders as to how to move forward. So Kiana and Zalima, I'm turning it back over to you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. So as our executive director has stated, what redistricting is the process of redrawing political boundaries. And I hope you are able to participate in week 1, but if you are not, that's okay, because we usually pick up and do a review of where we left off and try to make sure that you can seamlessly follow the next week's advocacy training. And so we want to make sure that you understand that this is a process where you put yourself on the map, where you actually get to draw your community of interest in your neighborhood, in your assembly district, in your congressional district, and the congressional process is what goes first in your city council district, as we probably have to do those maps twice. In any case, it is about advocating for the Black community, and that will assist the Center for Law and Social Justice with their map drawing needs, and because we want to make sure that we're advocating for all of Black New York City.
Sorry to interrupt, Salima.
Yeah.
Let me share. Something's going on with your slides. You can use my slides just because you're having we see something.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me
So I should stop my share. Okay.
just sorry about that. Just something's going on with. Okay, can you see him?
Yep.
Okay. Can you see my slide, my redistricting slide, or no?
I can.
Okay, so let me know when you need me to switch.
Okay, so go backwards, I think. Okay, so it all begins with the census, as you know. Let me, if you want, you can go back to the previous slide where we were week 1. Okay, no, the next slide, sorry. Okay, so that's the correct one. Okay, so in the first week 1 in review, we did an overview of redistricting, and we just explained what that is. That's the redrawing of districts, whether it's the local, state, or congressional district, so that we make sure that every vote counts, one person, one vote, and this must be mathematically equal for the congressional district. Every population must be equal in each congressional district. So we went through the overview of the redistricting process. We talked about geocoding, which we'll go over some more today. We talked about how geocoding really takes place with the assemblage of Geo IDs. Essentially what that is that a number is assigned to each block, each census block group, each census tract, and on to more to larger political and administrative boundaries, such as the districts themselves. There is geospatial data, which we upload in a program, and the Census Bureau refers to those as the Tiger files. And those are shape files. It doesn't contain demographic data, but they are uploaded into a shape file, and then we lay demographic data on top of it so that we could effectively draw these one person, one vote maps. And we do this with the geographic information systems. Now they are more user-friendly and free databases to use. Prior to this, in the last redistricting period, really this redistricting period, the communities were really shut out in terms of the access that they would gain from this. So we didn't have that much access, and the amount of programming that was available cost thousands of dollars, thereby locking out a number of communities from the redistricting process. So it was this big secret. And that's why a lot of people don't know about the process, because it was a very expensive one and was more so for the politically astute. Now we have undergraduate students creating these programs. And we went through and showed what the ACS data can do for our communities. There are power in numbers, there's power in information. So how much we can advocate if we have the American Community Survey or census data, and we know how it can be broken down and interpreted. So we created an ACS story, and the community was, satisfied with it, because they saw what they can use it for in terms of their nonprofit advocacy and their community advocacy, and how they lobby for their community of interest, and how we access ACS data. So last week, Kiana, next slide. And so today we will try to move the needle a little bit further and talk about how we identify and choose the correct geography for redistricting and drawing a map, how we identify the correct data needed for the geography that you have chosen, how you grasp the use of election data in the redistricting process, and how we comprehend how election data interact with census data to produce maps. So these are the stepping stones of the process that most people don't see and most people don't like, because they don't understand all what goes into those pretty maps that we see later on. So I'm going to stop here, and Kiana will take a poll.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. We just want to pause for a second to get a gauge of the where everyone is with it when it comes to redistricting within the room. So here's a poll. Oh my God. What is, sorry about that. That's not good.
There it is.
Oh, you see it?
I see it.
Oh, perfect. I don't see it on my end, so that's why. Sorry about that. So yeah, if you could take about maybe 30, 45 seconds to take the poll, would be greatly appreciated.
So it looks like 12 of the 19 folks on have taken the poll thus far. We'll give another 15 seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll now. We've got 78% who responded. And here are the results. Kiana, are you able to see those on your screen?
No, I can't.
Okay, so question number one, have you ever participated in the redistricting process before? 3 of us say yes, 20%, 12 of us say no, we are newbies. If no, for the majority of us, what are you most interested in? 40% say data analysis and 60% say map drawing. Third question, if yes, in what capacity? And the few of us who answered that were evenly split between data analysis, map drawing, and community testimony. And about 73% of those who answered did take the week 1 training, so only 4 did not.
Okay. So that's good news. So at least the information that was discussed last week will be a continuation for those that are participating now. So great. So Zalima, I'll turn it back over to you to continue. Thanks everybody for participating.
Thank you. Next slide. Okay. Next slide. So here we begin week 2. And I want to start by saying that we need data. And so we have to embrace the data. We have to have geographic data, where we live, where voters live. Some of this may also include citizen voting age population data that we get from administrative records and other sources. We certainly need at least a certain number of 18-year-olds in our district to draw an effective map. And those 18-year-olds at least have to be citizens. So we need the citizen voting age population, we need geographic data, we need other population data from the decennial census, but in this case, we'll try to work with the American Community Survey. The difference is that one is built on supposedly no error, and the American Community Survey has at least a 10% error built in because a sample is taken. And we often take election data, and we use election data because we want to see certain patterns in how people voted to make sure that we are effective. We will be able to choose a candidate of our choice, that we are able to match certain voting districts with the census geographic unit, and that we have a certain number of individuals registered to vote in our community. Continue. So the geographical data are important because these are where communities are developed. Communities develop geographically. Some may call it a territorial test. Others may call it, try to infringe upon the communities of interest definition test. But it is true that communities develop geographically. Now, just because you're located in one community does not mean geographically, one area geographically does not mean you don't share an interest with another geographically located community, and so can consider yourselves communities of interest. But normally we try to consider individuals within the same space. So we have the courts have not officially defined communities of interest, but for our sake, we will just say that communities develop geographically. And in this case, this is where we want them because we know that people move for social reasons, economic reasons, and political reasons. And so people gather where they're comfortable. And we want to be able to advocate for our communities legislatively and in a representative fashion. And this is why we're doing this. The Census Bureau configures population counts and data according to certain levels of geography. They are configured by blocks, census block groups, census tracts, county subdivisions such as community districts, which is often synonymous with council districts or assembly districts. They're broken down by counties, traffic analysis zones. So if we're wondering why our bus routes and our train routes are not connected directly to services, we should pay attention to our map drawing process this round, such as going to a hospital from where we live, direct access, direct services. Voting districts, that's just what all these things are, but there's a larger level that the Census Bureau tries to locate things with, and those are usually the other, a little bit smaller than the legislative districts. School districts, so how our schools are zoned is a big deal because we know sometimes that schools are split between assembly districts and different districts that are placed them outside of where we would normally feel comfortable to advocate for our children to our elected officials. So we have to make sure that those line up. And of course, state legislative districts and congressional districts, which we approach first, zip codes, states, region, and nation. So this is how the geographical breakdown is for the census. And I went from the lowest to the highest. Geographical data ultimately must conform to shape. Can't be ill-shaped map, right? It has to be nicely drawn. That's how you know that you're keeping the communities together. It's usually the naked eye test. It has to be according to size, cannot be too large. It cannot have to be compact and have to be contiguous, meaning that no parts of the district is broken up, no block is separated out of the district. You can get from one end of the district to another without leaving the district. Next slide. Geographical data is usually given to us, as I said before, in a tiger shape file. This is what the Census Bureau calls it. It's a topical graphic file where we upload different things into the file. No demographic data, we would overlay that, but the tiger file, which the Census Bureau provides to us, is uploaded into the GIS system. So it's a shape file. It's a geospatial data format of use in geographic information system. And it usually contains all the different features that we need, the water, the different boundaries, the different blocks, et cetera. So all the different things that we need access to and how it's coordinated, it's there, but the numbers are not there. We have to provide that. It is configured using a master address file. So every decennial census, they go around, they have canvassers go around, or now it's a little bit more sophisticated, but in the old days, they had people go around and ensure that people's addresses were correct, that buildings weren't abandoned, that new construction that was developed, that it was included in the system. So we had a local update, if you will, of addresses, and it was placed in the master address file, which was then assigned a geographic ID. And so this is what we use to coordinate with the census blocks, if you will. So we have to make sure addresses are correct, And the way we do that sometimes is we look at the Department of Buildings, we look at administrative records to make sure to get an angle on new construction or any additions to buildings, and on and on and on. So we look at utilities bills, tax codes, anything from the IRS to say that someone lives in a particular apartment and things of that nature. So we want to make sure these things are accurate. So the census is not just about going from door to door or completing an address or going to a group quarter. There's a lot of things that get into play with it, just like citizen voting age population. And so we complete a list of new housing construction, such as new nursing homes, et cetera. Geographic features such as attributes and legal statistical boundaries are also included, as I said before. Next slide, please.
So we're gonna, oops, sorry, I'm clicker happy. So we just want to find out if anyone knows what information is covered in a Geo ID. That's something that we will be covering, but we kind of want to get a sense of, does anyone know what that is and what information is covered in it? If you haven't heard of it, it's fine, we'll cover it. But if you have, can you list in the chat what information is in Geo IDs? If you don't know, you can just say, I don't know. Just trying to see if people are familiar with it.
And as questions come in, Kiana, there's also a question in the chat asking for an explanation of the illustration.
The illustration?
Okay.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, longitude and latitude, is that lawn?
Yep.
Let me come out of here and then I can show my screen.
Okay, you want me to stop sharing?
1 second.
Okay. And Mary also had a question about week one's.
Yep, I answered that one in the chat, so she's good to go. But we have a couple of answers here for the question about what is in a Geo ID. I think this is latitude, longitude, the state ID, the census tract ID as well. So those are a few of the responses for what is in the Geo ID. And then we see from Kevin, state, county, down to state legislative tracts for census. So all of those are responses to that question.
Very good. So now Dr. Blair is going to go into detail about what they are. That's some information.
I can share my screen a little bit. So I just wanted to see how the Census Bureau actually sometimes puts this. They give it, they code all the blocks, sometimes from the Census Bureau, and they coordinate it with the city and state data. And they have, this is sometimes when it's overlaid with each other. So a block, this is starting from B, usually has an ID coded with it. And if you scroll down and they tell you, and this is like what we would see from the ACS, and per block, you would see the total population and by age and all the different demographic variables, if you will. And if you scroll down some more, you can see the total population by sex, et cetera. So if these were overlaid in a geographic map, you would see how it was coded prior to. If it was in an Excel spreadsheet, it would have, the person is correct, a latitude and longitudinal point, a Geo ID in an Excel spreadsheet that will be then uploaded on the map. This is an extra layer where we would see the different populations and the different demographics associated with each block, et cetera. If it were in, and I'll come back to this later on, the Board of Elections, let me pull that up. Let me see if I have it. Let's say a map. Do I have a map? Oh, if it were in a map, we would see, this is how we would pair. So I was speaking of geographic codes. Registered voters are actually coded, and also their address is given a Geo ID, and they're placed in precincts. As we know, when we go to the polls, sometimes if we don't know our precinct number, we have to stand online, but we're affiliated with a precinct and our addresses are coded, and we would match these numbers, right? These different blocks with their Geo IDs with a census block, so that we make sure that both geographies are coordinated, but we could get more in detail down the line. So, little preview of the process of overlaying electronic maps. It would be overlaid with the shapefile, with the census maps, and with the thing. Only thing we would be looking at matching IDs, right? These IDs, block IDs, with the census block IDs, which are similar. We would just have to make sure that the block, a census block, which may be over here in 5414, may be coordinated with something that's over here, and try to match them and make sure that the boundaries match.
I think your question just got answered, Ethel. Ethel asked a question in the chat. Is a precinct equal to election district?
Okay, so that's what I was trying to explain. So the precinct comes closest to census block group. So there's a group of blocks, right, that match a census tract, which matches a precinct. Census tract matches a precinct. So census tract will be more affiliated with the precinct, that square radius. But they don't exactly match. And that's why we use the geo identifiers, right, to ensure that they match up. If I'm making sense. Making sense? Okay. All right.
Ethel, does that help? I'm going to share my screen again.
Okay. Could you just make it a little bit bigger?
Oh, you can't?
I don't try to tell my age, okay? Just make it a little bit larger.
Okay, hold on one second. Okay. All right.
You okay, Kiana?
Yeah, this is, I'm just to go
Okay.
out of one and come, oops, sorry about that.
That's okay. So yeah, the Geo IDs, as we go on and on, this is something I'll repeat each week, because the more you do it, the more you get used to it, because you have to understand that the census doesn't make life easy for us, as we can see now with the pandemic. We have to wait for the data. So, you know, we just have to always play with these little areas to ensure, and that's not the only thing, when we have to then get the codes to overlay with the citizen voting age population to ensure that we have enough voters in the district. That's another layer that we have to add. So it's a lot of geography to play with, and it's a lot of numbers also to play with. You want me to show my screen instead? Or?
Oh, no. See,
okay.
Hold on, I'm sorry.
Dr. Blair, as Kiana's bringing that up, there's a question in the chat.
Sure.
Two questions, actually. Is a precinct an official political unit within each assembly district? And then there's a question, are there minimum numbers for these categories? For example, an election district is between 600 and 900 people, so on and so forth.
Okay, so again, it goes by, so the census block is the lowest number, and that could be anywhere from a few people to 500 or whatever. Census block groups go all the way up, could go all the way up to 2,000. So it really, they divide it really according to the accurate count of the census. but they try to keep it within that range. In terms of a larger district, like a city council district, we see them range from 168,000 or 140,000 all the way up to 200,000. There's a range there. The only district that cannot really have a range is the congressional district. Out of all the congressional districts, 435 of them, and the ones in the US Virgin Islands, et cetera, they can only deviate by one person. The others can deviate up to 10%. Some states say 5% either way. We don't have that differential, although the Redistricting Commission is trying to make it plus or minus 5, but it has gone from -1 to +9, as long as it's only a 10-point swing. I didn't hear the first question.
Is a precinct an official political unit within each assembly district?
Yes, it's an electoral district. We call it electoral district. It's the ED, and so that's where the votes are counted. So the precinct is the ED. Mm-hmm.
Great questions.
Next is
Next.
Okay, so the Census Bureau and other state and federal agencies are responsible for assigning, which we talked about a little bit, geographic identifiers or Geo IDs to geographic entities to facilitate the organization, presentation, and exchange of geographic and statistical data. So when I brought up that screen with all those numbers that were quote unquote in a comma delimited fashion, you can see that it was done by blocks or block groups, and it had some demographic data attached to it. Geo IDs are numeric codes that uniquely identify all administrative / legal and statistical geographic areas for which the Census Bureau tabulates data, and it matches, right? It's done from the census, and it's all the way around. And they give, again, the local governments an opportunity to update their address system and to be a part of the process. This is done anywhere 3-4 years out prior to the census, the decennial census. And some of the most common administrative and legal and statistical geographic entities with unique Geo IDs include, which we said, states, counties, congressional districts, core-based statistical areas, census tract, block groups, and census blocks. Next slide.
Mary has a question. Should each ED have the same number of registered voters?
They don't always do. They should. They're in a range. They should have the same number of voters, but they don't often have the same number of voters. They often have the same number, the same block groups radius. So that's why it's a range from a few hundreds to a certain amount, but it's never the exact same number. It's a deviation. When it gets too much, what we start to see is that they split. When it goes over a certain amount, say it goes over 2,000 or so, or whatever number they choose, they split those precincts. And then the Board of Elections have to then update it. But the Board of Elections is the one, our local county Board of Elections are in charge of splitting those precincts when it gets above a certain amount. So all the development we've been seeing in the community, they can change. One little sliver could change your boundaries. Okay, so geographic location, geospatial data is geographic location on Earth. So we have that map for us, and then we overlay the census geographies. And then we have voter tabulation districts and block data. Next slide. And as we stated, it's analyzed using GIS, and GIS is a framework for gathering, managing, and analyzing data. Early on, Esri has cornered the field. ArcGIS, most of you probably have heard of them. They cornered the field in geographic information software. They do a lot of different things, and they do it all over the world. You see visually anything all over the world. So I get lost a lot. So I often say that the GPS is the best thing that happened in like the last quarter of a century, right? And that is using GIS software, GIS information systems to get you from point A to point B. And now we have other automated systems that pair with it, right? When we open up our phones, we see the location of where we are on the map, etc. So this process has been in play for a while. We're just now getting used to it in drawing maps, and it's just now becoming more user-friendly. So maps are examples of spatial data and easily communicate complex analysis. And what they're meant to show is patterns. And the beauty of using this system actually is that you're able to mix data. So I can't just upload any data in Excel or SPS. I have to make sure it's coordinated. But in GIS, you could upload a number of data in different forms and just use it as another layer. You have your base map and you have a layer. Next slide.
Mary had another question. She said,
Sure.
this is going off of her previous question. So in areas with low registered voters, the registered voters can have an outside, can registered voters have an outside influence? So in areas with low registered voters, the registered.
Yeah, that's the whole argument behind the group quarters argument, right? The prison industrial complex, right? Because there's a small amount of registered voters. This happens in Ohio, this happens in Iowa, but we know it to happen in upstate New York, where a small amount of registered voters control a large system. They have more than one vote, one person. They have a larger influence in the system. Down here, we have in downstate New York, there are many people who are not counted, including individuals who return home, including that re-entry process when formerly incarcerated individuals return, right? So they're not yet registered or re-registered, although they can register to vote, they just didn't know the rules. But the upstate New York counties, and we know how they created an extra seat for up there, the upstate counties where all the prisons were located, those individuals are not voting. The only two states were allowing them to vote from prison were Maine and Vermont. But the upstate part of it, they were not voting, and their letters were not being answered, and their letters were not, and their demands were not being heard. But the people in the surrounding counties or in the surrounding communities, they had access to these legislators more than any other individual. Especially in comparison to downstate New Yorkers who didn't have this access. Just think in a congressional district where 435 seats are divided by 711,000 or 718,000, et cetera, depending on the state that you live in, 717,000. But think of how many more individuals were afraid to be counted. So upwards of 1 million. And so that's less than one person, one vote. So yeah, of course.
Great question.
GIS is a computer software, as I stated, and it links to geographic information where things are with descriptive information. So we may want to know, and I love to use this, where to put a hospital, because, you know, when we think about this access to affordable care, most people only think about insurance, but they don't think about the actual facility. So we want to know where we need to put things. Is there a county, or is there an area that has a large number of chronic illnesses that we can map and that we can say, aha, this is a place where we need it. So it shows the patterns, it shows the descriptive information, where things are, where things are not, where things are overloaded. GIS, unlike a flat map, present many layers of different information. And I told you before, we can import data on top of there. So in the redistricting software, when you get a chance to use it, if you have not already done so, you know that some software comes preloaded with the information already, with the decennial census data already. Each layer represents a particular theme or feature of the map. You can upload it if it didn't have it already to include where the waters are, the bridges are, and of course, other different features, buildings, etc. But that's where you would see the tiger shape files. And then again, the data, and you could use different data. You could find where veterans are. You can find other information that's needed. How many males are in a particular area? How many females on a particular area and go by age and see what programs, or just map crimes, right? Map schools. That's what was done with actually the $1 Million Blocks, the Fifth Avenue Committee in Park Slope. They were the first ones to say, hey, our communities on one block, $1 million is spent in prisons versus on our schools, and only 20,000 per child is spent on schools. So this is where we can map information block by block. Next slide. Okay, so I told you a little bit about the tools. I was hoping our team, we tried to find, because it's a really fun game for you to play, but if you get a chance, you can look at other instruments beforehand, but we were trying to find a redistricting game for you to play, but it was no longer available, but it would have shown you the tediousness that goes into it. But these are the most popular software now, but as I said, more, these cost money, but more are user-friendly. So Esri, which I mentioned before, cornered the market a long time ago. Maptitude supports census, geography, and redistricting data. In fact, this is what it's predominantly made for. CityGate aids legislative and congressional redistricting, and iRedistrict, redistricting software funded by the NSF. Next slide. So we spoke a little bit about incarcerated persons. So Mary, you sort of preempted me, because this was a law that was passed in New York and in several states, but it's not a uniform version. But the census now, besides for the decennial census, they actually provide additional data for group quarters. And it was mostly because we wanted to count individuals who were incarcerated, where they were located. So this was sparked by bigger research, Brookings Institute, et cetera, Jeremy Travis, lots of different people. And then our own congressional individual, Hakeem Jeffries, he sponsored the legislation about putting and counting individuals where they live, because quote unquote, they all come back. Very few are serving life sentences in state prisons and federal prisons. So New York passed a law to collect the home addresses of incarcerated people and to require the state and county governments to draw legislative districts on the basis of the Census Bureau data connected to count incarcerated people at their home addresses. Because we know that the census exists to give out funds to different communities and for different purposes, these individuals are often shortened services, right? Where they come home, when they come home, shelters, housing projects, a lot of different things they don't have access to, because these resources are going upstate where they were originally counted. Next slide. So the population data, decennial census. So this includes, this is from a law, Public Law 94-171, which are broken down by population terms and housing terms. And this actually, the decennial census goes all the way down to the block level. So that's how we know on our blocks all the different demographic information for individuals. So population by race, age, Hispanic or Latino origin, household relationship, individual, household type, household size, family type, family size, group quarters, which is new, and housing item, housing terms. Next slide.
Okay. Quick question. Mary has another one. If a critical number of persons change their birth certificate sex to X, will that impact planning for health and social services by sex?
If a critical number, because it all goes by self-identification. So if a person changed their sex ID, their gender identification, and it contributes to a significant number in a particular area or particular community, I would imagine so.
Dr. Blair,
yes.
if I may, this question came up, or a similar question came up in a webinar that we had in collaboration with the LGBT Center. And the
Mhm.
question was, how do we effectively identify in a non-binary way, for example, but
Mhm.
still secure the health benefits that might be aimed for bodies that have a composition more considered female versus male? And
Right.
how do you adequately,
Mhm.
advocate for yourself in that regard? And because, even the census is still at the very beginning of having conversations about how to allow people to properly identify, this is sort of where ongoing advocacy has to take place. Because if
Mhm.
you are a person who shows up in a body that medical science traditionally treats as female, and a significant number of similarly situated persons then change their gender to X, that might have unintended consequences that need to be considered whenever any sort of advocacy campaign would be put together or promoted based on those types of identity changes and markers.
That's a good way to look at it. And so it becomes pretty complicated. And I guess you would have to probably, right, Larry, advocate for more organizations such as Planned Parenthood or other civil rights organizations to take up these matters, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you are a part of a community that is seeking this type of social policy change, these are just some of the things to think about and to be aware of when it comes to talking points, when it comes to organizing and being able to respond to just the very practical questions that identity-based resource distribution can raise for people.
Mhm.
So absolutely.
Great question. So to get back to group quarters, the Census Bureau published a Federal Register note. Well, it publishes, that's what it does. Each decennial census, they put it in and they list the criteria as they do with any change of law, et cetera. And so what they did with this one, they did it to, hear comments, notice, comment, and procedure. Stated that, and this is a quote, "We will continue the practice of counting prisoners on the correctional facility because it is a group quarter and it is where the person is on April 1st, right? To ensure that the concept of usual residence is interpreted and applied consistent with the intent of the Census Act of 1790. But it also stated that the Census Bureau recognizes that some states have decided or may decide in the future to move their group quarters population, student, military, and prisoner population to an alternate address for the purpose of redistricting. To assist those states, the Census Bureau is offering the use of a geocoding service, and this is where they give the data to count individuals and reallocate that population where they had their last permanent address. Next slide, sorry. So the Bureau's practice is to count persons incarcerated in state and federal correctional facilities where they are confined. New York counts incarcerated individuals at their permanent address or their residence and are included in electoral districts. Legislation passed to end prison-based gerrymandering. And as I said, that was the more than one person, one vote scenario, especially in upstate New York. Next.
Just want to note that Mary said this is an ongoing debate that's happening in Scotland regarding
Yeah.
the social service. I guess this if persons were to change their sex.
Mm-hmm.
It's taking place. She said on March 21st. The census in Scotland. So
Okay.
yeah. Next slide.
So we discussed at length the last time, but just for your review, the American Community Survey, that's where we're relying on the American Community Survey, but there are different versions of the American Community Survey. And the American Community Survey is the long form census. So the last time the long census form was used, and it really is long, but it gives a lot of detailed information, such as even internet access, right? And citizenship, that's the famous, right? Or the infamous citizenship question. But it's the long form and it's only given to a sample of households each year, and they do it each year, but there are different versions. There's a 1 year, there used to be a 3 year, they discontinued the 3 year version. And there's a 5-year version, which we would use because that's the data that gets us closest to the decennial census. And that's because the 1 year only gets us to maybe the community board level. But the 5-year ACS summary, which the 2019 one was not too long ago released, gets us to the block level. So that's the type of, that's the version we would rely on and sort of make our estimations and our predictions based on the 10% error margin that is usually built into it. Next.
So this is one of our last questions. We just want to know, do any of you know of an election in New York City that may have or was racially polarized? If you can put your response in the chat. So do you know of any election that you can think of in New York City that was racially polarized?
So before I ask, does everyone know what racial polarization is?
That's a good way to start. Let's see. Giuliani versus Dickens.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Somebody said most. Bloomberg and Thompson.
Well, I don't know. To an extent, yeah.
Yeah, so that's, yep, people are agreeing, saying the same. Yes, and B. Yep, okay, so.
Next. Oh, did everyone get to answer?
Yeah, well, they're still putting it in. Let's see.
Sure, let's wait for them.
Okay, so Kevin wrote, I remember when Tisa James ran for public advocate.
And that's what I was trying to see, yeah.
You can see?
Yeah, no, I can't see, but I was looking at those results prior to, and I was trying to see if it was really against Daniel Squadron, right? And I was trying to see if it was racially polarized, but it didn't appear to be. We thought it would be. That's a good call. We thought it would be, but it wasn't. Well, you're kind of right? Because I was looking at the 41st Assembly District that spans, in that Brooklyn area to all the way down to Sheepshead Bay, et cetera. So some parts of that area where we saw that, was a little bit smaller population there. We saw that they were a pretty homogenous community and they mostly voted for Squadron. But Letitia James, remember, came from a gentrified city council district, so she knew how to navigate those waters and sort of gained a lot of white votes as well.
Dr. Blair, you're fading again. You're fading into the background.
Kiana, that's you doing that? How did it disappear before?
Yeah, I'm trying to make it interesting. Okay. Now you have the bridge behind you.
Again, I didn't touch anything. So bear with me, folks.
It's treating your orange screen as a green screen. Your orange wall behind you. I've never seen
That's what it is.
It's reading it as a green screen, I think.
So election data, this is where a lot of the testimonies come in, because you really have to do and think about that analysis, because if you cannot elect a candidate of your choice because of how your district is drawn, if you show that, and we don't like to take race into consideration, but if it has to be taken into consideration and there's a compelling interest, it must be taken into consideration. And so if someone is affecting my right to vote and my right to choose a candidate because the group of voters consistently vote against the minority voter or the minority candidate, and it's done in a block, election after election, and you can show this, then you can use race and you can use that as a way to draw a district where you can choose a candidate of your choice. And there are ways to do this, right? And so we can talk about that a little bit. And so this determines if racial polarization exists. and that we use election data. So that's why elections become extremely important in analyzing election returns by precincts/EDs. And this highlights the polarized voting concerns. It identifies racial bloc voting and racial appeals in the campaigns, and it helps courts determine the state of minority and majority community. Next slide. So how is election data? How is it used? How are election data used? We would review voting results per district, and we would also complete the total demographic statistics for the same electoral district. So let me deviate a little bit. We will code each electoral district. I don't like to use that word code because then it's a small word, but it gets scary, right? If an electoral district, if we see, and this is easily denoted in like the city planning data, et cetera, if you find that your precinct or your electoral district is upwards of 85 to 90% Black or upwards of 85 to 90% white, then you could effectively assume that the voter from that electoral district is a white voter. And you know, it comes with some error, but most of the time you're right. That's why we use 90% or 85%. Some people have gone down all the way to 80%, but I wouldn't take that risk. And so what we do is we look at the demographic data on an individual basis, race, education, income, occupation, and the goal is to infer how demographic subgroups voted. And again, we could assume from each electoral district that these are a particular racial group and they are voting, making the choice to vote in a block against the minority candidate. And so inference, also known as the ecological inference, right? We're assuming based individual level data based on aggregate data. And so we draw this inference about it. We want to make sure we don't commit this fallacy, right? You know, sometimes we accuse people of being stereotypical at times, and we make this fallacy based on this large assumption that an individual is behaving this way because this is the way a group of individuals are depicted. But in the case of voting patterns, if you see that in an electoral district, if you see like ED in Howard Beach, for example, which is most of the time predominantly white, you can infer that the voter from that ED is white, and you can see the patterns in which they have voted. So it's not so much of a fallacy there because the aggregate data is overwhelming. And that's why you choose the right cutoff level when preparing these arguments, that you need to draw this district in this fashion and represent this community of interest this way. So ecological inference is the process of extracting clues about individual behavior from information reported at the group or aggregate level. Ecological inference is used to determine if these patterns exist. So this is why we ask, right? Are there any recent ones? We can't think of any recent ones at the moment. This election cycle should be a good one to determine that, these local election cycles. Next slide.
Dr. Blair?
Yes.
Quick question for you. Do you think that the shift to ranked choice voting will have an impact on our ability to determine some of this information?
I knew that question was going to be asked. And you know, I think the ranked choice voting actually takes away the racial polarization, because now you have options. You have 5 different choices, not as if you're going to put all the one candidate 1 through 5, because that ballot will be tossed out. But you can rank. So if I'm a white person, I'm going to rank the white candidate of my choice. But if it's not all the white, not all the candidates are white, I can include a Latino voter. I can include a Black voter. I can include certain things. It depends. If we look at the voter data on all 5 different choices, depends. Or we only look at the winner, and then we look at the percentage or the plurality of voters who voted for this winner and how it adds up to that. So it's a series of things, and we would have to look at all 5 choices and to see who came up with behind those 5 ranked individuals. But I think it takes away the racial polarization argument, actually.
Sounds like it is an argument for us to have more researchers
Yeah.
of color to help crunch some of that data. We're going to need it.
Yep. So racial polarized voting exists when voters of different racial and ethnic groups exhibit very different candidate preferences in an election. It simply means that voters of different groups are voting in opposite directions rather than in a coalition. RPV does not mean that voters are racist. It only measures the outcome of voting patterns and determines whether patterns exist based on race/ethnicity. Minority voters are voting one way and non-minority voters are voting another way. That might be an interesting question for like borough president and comptroller races. Next slide. So the simplest method for estimating voting behavior by race/ethnicity is to compare voting patterns in homogeneous precincts, which I just described. You know, we would determine whether or not this is a predominantly Black electoral district or this is a predominantly white electoral district. And that is election precincts that are composed of a single racial/ethnic group. If there is a precinct composed entirely of Black voters and the voters within that precinct give 85% of their votes to candidate C, then we know that 85% of the Black voters supported candidate C. So since precincts are usually not exclusively one race/ethnicity, precincts 90% or more single race/ethnicity are usually considered homogeneous for purposes of this analysis. So we sort of increase that number and make it a bigger, more of a buffer, if you will. Ecological inference is used to determine if these patterns exist. Next slide. So for this test, courts would determine whether the minority community was populous and geographically concentrated enough. Remember, I gave you that test before, whether or not it's compact, it's not, it's contiguous, the shape is decent, and you really, it's no way to really describe it. Think of like a puzzle, you know, and a finished puzzle looks decent, right? It has the nice shape, it has, you know, you start to see things forming out and it's compact, right? Things get pulled apart or it's not yet completed or it's not assembled properly or you're trying to mix different things up. You know, it's not contiguous, it's ill-shaped. And so you can't really claim that, you know, this racial bloc is voting against you because you don't have that geographically low concentrated population. But a lot of times you do. And this argument is still playing out till this day in different states, especially. So where the minority community was politically cohesive, that means they voted together, but they could not elect a candidate of their choice. And whether the majority community voted sufficiently as a bloc to usually defeat minority preferred candidates under the status quo electoral system. This happened a lot. We have single member districts here, but we, at one time in the history of New York City, we had at-large districts. And then in the 90s, we overturned that. Polarized voting was treated as a reliable indicator of minority exclusion from the normal push and pull of pluralist politics, or of intentional race discrimination against minority candidates by white voters and elites. Racial bloc voting and racial appeals in the campaign process provide the best evidence of private prejudice. Next slide. And so, you know, to end, this is really a time where we have to know how to define our communities of interest. And as I said, there's no real legal definition, but it's a group that comes together. And it's not the direct factor in redistricting, but it is the underlying factor. The direct factors are all the principles that I labeled before, the contiguity, the compactness, et cetera, that this is what the courts look at. And then if those are drawn out, or inappropriate, we go to say, well, if it's drawn this way, these communities of interest and these boundaries would not be respected. And so it's made up of economic, ethnic, cultural, religious, or immigrant communities, tourism areas, media markets, outdoor recreation or natural resource areas or bonds. And basically, it's what a group of people could come together and advocate on, or legislators can put together legislation to represent this community. And it could be a small nucleus of individuals, or it can grow to be the largest block. And it usually takes about a generation for that to happen. So the last redistricting cycle we saw in Southeast Queens that they drew a map, and although it wasn't enough, the community of interest that they were growing wasn't enough, all deaf. It wasn't enough to elect a candidate of their choice. Now it is. A decade later, we see that they knew that people would move to these areas because people move where they're comfortable with, where they can grow their business, location, location, location. So it's all about the territory and the geography. So it's a contiguous area on a map, linkage to public policy issues of common interest, and it does not promote a particular political party or candidate or jurisdiction. So these underlying issues, and I put them last, so they are always the underlying factor. It's the overarching material in redistricting.